We got Sarah Sentis from Manager Tools on the podcast this week. I did a Manager Tools conference several years ago and found it to be one of the most helpful and most effective things in terms of learning how to actually run a business as opposed to faking at running a business. And in this podcast, we talk about a bunch of concepts related to management, but it's not just about, middle management at large corporations and dry, boring stuff like that. This is really about understanding relationships and understanding how to build relationships with people. So anyone who is in a situation where you need to use relationships to get things done, which is basically everybody on the entire planet, should hopefully get something pretty actionable from this. This is also pretty relevant to coaches as well, right? That good management is not just for large corporations. It's for any situation where you're giving feedback, you're communicating with someone else, etc. So check this one out. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. Hope you enjoy. All right, Sarah, so you have a background in not just teaching people about management, but managing yourself. And what I think is interesting, not managing yourself as a person, but you, in fact, were a manager in something that was an area that you didn't necessarily have any expertise in, which I imagine can be somewhat challenging and maybe a little bit uncomfortable. So do you mind giving us a little bit of a background in your management history there?
Absolutely. I began my managerial career. I was working at the University of Alberta, so in academia. My role there began as a temp at a really low level in the IT department at the university. To be clear, I was on the switchboard. I'm not an IT person, but working with and having relationships with individuals in the department, individuals at sometimes a high rank at the department, allowed for a situation where people saw me as more than my role. Being that I was in an IT department, though, and didn't have the skills for IT, it meant I took an administrative kind of route. I ended up as manager of executive operations, that is on the executive committee at the IT department at the University of Alberta. So my role, one of my roles predominantly, was to find outside sources of managerial guidance, a way to structure it. One thing that IT organizations specifically struggle with is people that work in IT don't consider themselves to be people persons. And individuals that don't consider themselves to be people persons generally aren't great at management, for example, generally aren't ideal at customer service, for example. So it came down a lot to soft skills that needed to be instilled in the department.
Yeah, totally. So you kind of had a start in the mailroom and work your way up story there.
You bet. Absolutely.
Yeah,
for sure I did.
And it sounds like you at least started to recognize some missing skills in terms of not just the technical aspect of what's going on, but you were able to say, hey, you know what, I do actually have some of these other skills where I can learn them in a way that potentially improves what's going on in the organization.
Absolutely. And it's pivotal when you're in a situation like that to rely on relationships with people. Right? I wasn't going to hold any clout with anybody in the department for my expertise and my skills using any system internally. Rather, it was more about your relationships and knowing people and showing that you care and having the ability to talk to individuals that you don't know that well. So my role a lot of times was just that soft skills stuff, building relationships with people. And I know firsthand, as somebody who wouldn't consider myself a people person, that building relationships is hard. It's not always that easy. So I had to personally seek a more structured way of building relationships and inserting that into my daily life. What am I going to talk to with these people? We have nothing in common. So creating more opportunities for relationships where they might not exist otherwise, I found to be really helpful, really helpful.
Yeah, and given the the situation where, you're managing people in a technical area where you don't necessarily have the expertise, a term that comes to mind is the idea of imposter syndrome, right? Meaning that, you may feel like, oh, I'm a fraud, and people might realize that I don't know what I'm talking about, or, I don't feel comfortable telling people what to do if I don't understand all the details of what's going on. And, a management situation is an area where that could come up. But I think that happens to folks in a lot of different areas in their life where they may end up in a position where they feel like they, maybe don't belong or are going to be found out. Did you experience any of that, or is that something that's, foreign to you?
Oh, I don't think that feeling is foreign to anybody, Todd. I really don't. I think I shouldn't say we all. Most of us have imposter syndrome most of the time. I spend a good deal of my life reminding myself that you might not be saying the perfect thing, Sarah, but they don't know what else to expect. I'm a public speaker. Oftentimes I'll be done presenting and I'm like, oh, that was just really rough. And I'll get glowing reviews from people. They're like, oh my goodness, that was amazing. I'm like, really? But it's important to remind yourself, I'm the only person that knows what it should have looked like. And for managers specifically, I tell people all the time, I know when you're an individual manager, you're thinking to yourself inside your head, you're like, oh my goodness, I have no idea what I'm doing. Everyone else must have it together. I mean, they look like they know exactly what they're doing. No, they don't know exactly what they're doing. They just look good at doing things that they know nothing about. Almost all the managers ever don't know what we're doing. We're just making it up. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to be honest. And as a manager, my number one go-to, if I don't know the answer, I am so sorry. I don't know the answer to that. Let me find it for you. There's nothing wrong with the transparency and humility to tell the folks that work for you, you know what? I don't have all the answers. Because you don't have all the answers all the time.
Yeah, it sounds like a takeaway there is that it's not necessarily about, like you said, having all the answers, and it's not necessarily about always being the most competent or the best at a specific thing, but nor is it about just having to fake it all the time, right? It's more about understanding, like, okay, even people who I look up to as the most competent people, that they might be making it up more than they look like.
Yeah.
And they just have the skill and the understanding of like, okay, here's what I know, here's what I can put into place, and I can adjust on the fly based upon that. And I trust myself to be able to make those adjustments.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all that analogy of that duck on the water who's paddling like crazy with his feet underneath. And nobody knows. I hear it all the time. People are like, how do you know exactly where you're going in every airport ever? I'm like, I don't know where I'm going. I'm 98% of the time lost, completely lost. I walk with purpose, though. People think I know what I'm doing. I don't always. And I think many of us go through life like that. I really do.
Yeah, and there's an element of, as you go through certain scenarios, like the proverbial duck paddling wildly underneath the water, you just start to understand that that's the dynamic of how things work. And then it may not be exactly comfortable to be in that position, but it's not quite as threatening, let's say.
You hit it on the head, Todd. Part of being a manager means getting comfortable with not being comfortable. That's part of the job. It's basically the job description. You're not going to know everything. Be comfortable not knowing everything. That's how it works.
Yeah, and trust the skills that you have and the communication skills that you've built and the relationships that you built to work to figure out solutions to problems.
Absolutely.
All right, love it. So I first met you in was it 2017?
I think it was 2015.
Was it really?
I think so.
No,
it was
it couldn't
a long
have been.
time ago.
It couldn't have been. Well, whatever. Several years ago, when my business partner Paul and I did a manager tools conference where we had grown our gym to a large enough size that we're like, okay, we have enough people here that are doing different stuff, and they don't always do what we want them to, and we don't know what the hell we're doing. And let's say the fitness industry is not necessarily known for having robust management practices, right? That there's not a lot of good information out there for fitness business owners about how to manage people. And I think actually a lot of people sort of self-select into the fitness industry potentially because they don't like traditional structures, right? That they're like, I don't want to work in an office. I can go to the gym and work out and train some people and not have to report to anyone. Like this sounds awesome, right? So yeah, exactly. And so, and I can certainly identify with some of that. I'm not someone who has historically done particularly well with, authority or someone telling me what to do, et cetera. But, we, like I said, as a business, we had sort of hit a point where we're like, okay, this is an actual problem for us that we need to solve. And came across some of the Manager Tools podcast and was like, oh, this is like really helpful and really good and very actionable. So like, let's go learn how to do this. And so all that to say, we're kind of circling in on this idea of a lot of folks listening to this are potentially in the fitness industry. A lot of folks listening to this are potentially in sort of like tech and tech adjacent industries that are not necessarily known for management structure as well, especially on kind of like the startup level. And a lot of them as individuals have in the past bristled at the idea of management, bristled at, having to fill out stupid reports and have some person who doesn't understand the skill of what they're doing, tell them what to do and give them ideas that don't make any sense. So I'd like to have a conversation just about, what is the actual value of management and what does management look like when done right? So if someone either comes to you with this idea of like, I don't want to be managed. Like my manager is an idiot and people should just be allowed to sort of execute on their skills. What do you say to that person?
I think there's a huge difference between bad management and management, but you're right. I agree. Lots of us, whether it's technology or whether it's in gyms or whether it's in restaurants, we work with tons of people from all walks of life and all of them bristle at the thought of management. Sometimes it's because of the time investment or the effort investment. But moreover, we tend to find it's just because of the stigma around the bureaucracy of it. It's important to realize, though, all of the startups want to someday not be startups anymore. And so many of those startups, that is, you and another business partner, you and Paul. The reason you came to this together is because you share an interest. You're already friends. You have tons in common. You know one another's characteristics in terms of, are they patient, loyal, honest? Are they trustworthy? Do I like this person? When you're a small startup of a handful of people that have shared values and likes, you don't need to enforce structure. The problem with lack of structure comes into play when you start growing beyond being able to hire your friends, right? That's where the problem comes into play because now there's an individual whom you might not know that well. You don't trust overly much. They're responsible for customer interaction and interfacing. And you realize that what they're doing is not in line with your personal wants for your business. That's when the structure of management comes into play. When you grow beyond you and your trusted friends, having management structure allows for the opportunities to interact or engage with those individuals. Because think of all the times you've tried to deliver a tough message to somebody. If you're delivering a tough message to someone whom you like and is kind and you respect, you can have a respectful engagement where the two of you banter back and forth and you come to an agreement at the end. But if you give that same message to someone who doesn't trust you and you and they kind of butt heads a bit, it's very different. It's much more of defense. It's much more of hesitation. It leads to managers holding back and not saying anything so that by the time we say something, we blow because we're so already angry by that point. And it's because we don't have a relationship. It's because we don't have trust. And as managers, when we're managing individuals whom we didn't come to the table with trust, it's an opportunity for us to look for for those chances to increase trust, to build relationship, to cause a situation where we can have that two-way back and forth conversation without defense, because we have each other's backs. And that's what the structure of management allows for. If you want to pass work down or help the organization grow, as managers, are focusing in on an individual in our organization and shining light on their skill set allows for them to maybe one day take a leadership role. In terms of individuals or entrepreneurs or the managers of a startup wanting to maintain a lack of structure, that is, everybody reports to the CEO around here. That's great. But is the CEO going to take the time to get to know and build relationships with and pay enough attention to each of those employees so that they feel valued, so that they feel like the CEO has their own personal career growth in mind? Is that CEO going to spend the time talking to them when they're struggling at things and helping them work through a better way of doing it? I don't think so. We don't want to instill the structure of management because it doesn't feel palatable. But what ends up happening is we lose our best employees because they don't feel invested in. And the individuals that are struggling don't get talked to or helped soon enough to do any measurable good. So retention then, or turnover in our staff struggles, right? We're losing good people. We manage to keep the ones that are not great at their job. And because no one's talked to them, it gets worse. So that, in my mind, is the power behind instilling some semblance of structure to an organization, even though we buck it.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of there being some sort of tipping point where it becomes relevant to really start focusing on that is important for folks to understand. Again, especially in people who are working in, a small, a boutique fitness gym, right? Where it's like, okay, you might have, 2 or 3 owner operators who are doing most of the work. You might have a few additional coaches who kind of pick up some stuff on the side, or, you might be running a startup where you have 3 or 4 people, most of whom are technical and writing some code, and maybe one of them is doing some marketing. And like you said before, it's like, okay, cool. We're all on the same page. We all know what we're doing. We're all sort of people who are self-starters and get things done on our own.
Yeah.
And at that stage, it doesn't necessarily feel like a good use of time to instill structure. And a lot of those people probably bristle at it. But there's a point where it's like, okay, now there's costs to not having structure.
Yeah.
And you may not be fully aware of what those are.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Don't instill structure in a place that you don't need it. If you're like, oh no, we don't need it, then don't get it. But if you're having those employee struggles, you're losing your top performers and you don't know why, because they seem real happy, but they keep leaving. Or you have those individuals that are struggling, and every time you try and talk to them, they seem to want to defend themselves or fight back. When you're having those issues, it's gone to a place, or you've grown to a place where a little bit of structure would be helpful or beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really important to sort of look out for, right? It's like, what are the sort of telltale signs that this is a missing piece that needs to be put in place? So you're looking at employee retention, you're looking at sort of defensiveness to feedback. Anything else that comes to mind?
In my mind, also growth in your organization. In terms of having a good relationship, it allows for managers to delegate things down to their directs. Give their directs, the folks that work for them, more responsibility. If you consider yourself to be an owner-operator and you think to yourself, you know what? I would love to have a vacation sometime where I didn't have to constantly be in my email or like calling into like important things. I kind of wish that they could run it themselves, and they seem to not be able to do this independently. That would also be one of those situations. I know lots of us struggle with the work-life balance, with the how do I make my family a priority when work constantly needs me? The way to approach it, or the way to work around that, is trusting the individuals who work for you to do more responsibilities on your behalf. If you're responsible for, doing like a profit and loss, doing a revenue statement for your group or every quarter, delegate the first draft of that to someone that works for you. It might not be their job. That's irrelevant. We could all use a little bit of practice doing a P&L once in a while. And it would allow for your directs to keep the wheels on the bus when you're not in the bus. Because we struggle and we say we want work-life balance, but then we don't do anything about it. Build a trusting relationship so you can enable the individuals that work for you to take on more. That's how.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. That another massive indicator is that you're having a hard time with delegation. I can speak to that from personal experience, where everyone who owns a business or is doing something that involves working with other people and they care about getting better, reads some book or listens to some podcast, and it's like you have to delegate, you have to pass off the things you're not good at, and you're like, okay, awesome, let's do this, and then you potentially come up with some tasks that you think you can pass off. You maybe write up an SOP for it, and you're like, cool, this is pretty straightforward. You just got to do these several things. You try to have someone do it, and you're like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, right. What in the world are you doing? You do these 3 things, and the thing is done. Why aren't you doing it? Right? Like, and it's like shocking, right? And then a lot of the time, the advice doesn't include anything about management. It just tells you to make an SOP and pass it off, and most of the time that just doesn't work.
Right. Exactly. Because not everyone thinks the way you do. We're all going to approach a problem completely differently. Our directs are going to approach it in a way we had no idea they'd approach it. And allowing for more of that relationship, more of that trust, more of that back and forth. I'm not saying I want the individuals that work for us to be reliant on us telling them, well, you need to follow these exact steps. We hire new, fresh, young talent into our organizations because we want them to innovate. Well, let's be clear. The definition of innovation is someone made a mistake one time and it was better than the real way. We know that, right? Like, people come into organizations and they're young and they're fresh and they want to share what's going on or what they've learned. And we say, okay, I want you to do exactly this and then this and then this. And we lay it out clear as day for them because that's the best way of doing it. But it stifles their creativity. That's how people innovate. Someone does something, you're like, that's never going to work. They do it, and it turns out to be better than the real way. This is the new way. This is incredible. We have to do this. It's that idea. It's allowing for more opportunities to communicate and back and forth and coming to the ideas together. But nothing hurts a manager more than delegating down an SOP, passing it to their direct, seeing it go horribly wrong, taking it back and having to do it ourselves. Because that was terrible. You never should have got that far away. You never should have got that far away from the project. More guidance than that is necessary for success. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And without some sort of management structure, it's very difficult to have the actual whatever relationship, like you mentioned, the communication, et cetera, to make sure that handoff goes well over time. Because you said, it's not enough to just pass it off because you end up just, it gets badly done for 6 weeks and then you take it back and everyone's mad.
Right. Well, and I know this isn't always possible. Like, I don't live on like a fluffy pink cloud, but I want people doing things they like to do and would get value from personally. I do. And I know many of us do things all the time that we don't like doing and we don't want to do, but that's our job and we do it. I know. But I want, when you're looking at, oh my goodness, I'd like to delegate this down or pass this to one of my directs. I want a world where you delegate it or assign it down to a direct and they get personal enjoyment from it. Or this would help them meet their longer term career goals. Or it's something they're really good at. The problem with not having that relationship means you're a manager that's just spraying it all over the place. Here's some work. I'm going to throw it in your direction. I hope you like it because I don't know what you like. That's a problem, right? People do better and work harder if they're invested in what they're doing. But if you don't know what they're invested in, how are you going to be more mindful about delegating or assigning those things down? You don't even know what they like, right? So all comes back to relationships.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Something else that I was thinking about as you were talking is that the absence of management doesn't mean that something doesn't just jump in to fill its space, right? So if, you're running a small organization with a few people who are highly invested and you start to add more people, it's not enough to just say, okay, you know what, we're not going to have a traditional management structure. It stifles people and creates sort of obnoxious games of internal politics. Based upon your previous experience, you may have seen things like that happen. But if you don't have some sort of structure, it's not like this, utopian ideal emerges. Instead, what instead emerges is a shadow structure that is oftentimes much more political and much more toxic than what would have been put in place if there was something formal.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that everything about life, work included, is a favor economy. Right? We're working the hardest and the best for the people we like the most. And yeah, we call it politics, but it's going to exist whether or not we purposely want it to. It's just how humans are. So you're absolutely right. Not instilling a structure to management or building relationships purposely where they wouldn't naturally exist causes even more of those structured, strong, political type relationships. More that cliquey, like, oh, they're friends. Like, they're obviously going to do that thing first for that person. That's who they like best. Why wouldn't they? Yeah. Because in the absence of being, I want to say, not forced to, but being made to have relationships with people they wouldn't naturally be drawn to, all they have is relationships with people they're drawn to. Politics exists. Don't fight it, but don't allow for a situation where it replicates upon itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that something else that's potentially important to note is that, if you have spent time in a large organization that does have a toxic political culture, and then you sort of jump to, the fitness industry or something smaller or whatever, you're like, cool, we're never doing that. And, it's difficult to understand that there's a lot of stuff in between, that it's not like you put someone in a management position or give them power and immediately you end up with this, bizarre labyrinth of horrible, mismanagement and Goodhart's law and backstabbing or whatever, that's something that develops over time based upon a lot of bad management principles and isn't the natural outcome of instilling some form of management.
Absolutely. I know at Manager Tools, we have specific guidance on a structure to put in place. But I tell people all the time, our guidance works for 90% of the managers, 90% of the time. There's nothing that's perfect. Like, I'll try to give you as close as I can to the science of management, but dude, it's an art. You have to make it your own. You're not going to find a canned out-of-the-box solution that's going to 100% work for you. Take all of the best things from what you know and make a process that works for you, a process that's founded on or rooted on building relationships with everyone in the organization, increasing trust, having more openness and transparency so that you're talking to individuals about what they're doing well and what maybe they need to work a little bit on, right? Creating an opportunity or a culture where people can admit when they're struggling and ask for help and be delegated to things they enjoy. It's not that you need to find an exact solution. I always want people to make it their own. Always. Yeah. But you're right. When people see what they don't want, they then for themselves create an opportunity where that will not happen here. The problem is, it's the polar opposite. If it's bureaucracy and they hate it because it takes forever and there's so much paperwork, they're going to create a completely bureaucracy-less, I don't think that's a word, bureaucracy-less organization, which also not overly successful.
Yeah, it's very easy to become reactive and to not understand the sort of trade-offs. And, sort of like we're saying, that just not doing something doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in its own form that might be worse than what had happened if you had put forth some sort of guidance. Yeah. So you've been discussing the concept of relationships a lot. And I mean, it sounds like the you can tell me if you agree with this or not. It sounds like you're saying that relationships are the fundamental part of management. Is that accurate?
Yes, I would agree 100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yes.
In terms of actually trying to make relationships a little bit more structured in an organization, what should that look like? What should people be thinking about if that's something they decide they want to do?
I think it means managers being accessible to their directs and all of their directs. I know oftentimes as managers, we have a situation where we may personally be, from a managerial perspective, bucking the bureaucracy. They are too, though. Our directs are as well. So as managers, we kind of set ourselves up for a bit of failure in that we instill more purposeful communications or building relationships with the people that want us to. But then there's those individuals that prefer to be left alone. So we leave them alone. And it sets up a double standard in our organization, right? Because there are people that want to be left alone, and we want to make them happy. We want to give folks an opportunity to be who they are. But what it causes is rifts in the organization. It causes people to, oh, well, why doesn't he have to do one-on-ones? Or, oh my goodness, why do they get to do them and I don't get to do them? As a manager, I think it's really an important thing to keep in mind. If you haven't explicitly told people exactly why you're doing what you're doing, they've all, inside their own heads, made up a reason. The reason's probably not true, and the reason is probably super malicious also. That's just a good general rule. As a manager, they've made something up about why you're doing what you're doing. It's not good. Tell them why you're doing what you're doing. And try and treat people not necessarily equally, but fairly, right? At least have the semblance of equality on your team. Some people are going to excel. You're going to want to spend more time with them. Some people aren't. But you don't want to set up different managerial structures for every person that works for you. That's too confusing. It leaves too many gaps. But yeah, at the end of the day, relationships, causing more situations or opportunities for you to converse with your directs, and not just about what you want to hear about. That is, you want to hear about work. We usually want to hear about work. But what they want to share with us. Right? It's a really important differentiation. When managers begin and start the conversation, we lead it where we want it to go. And ultimately, it'll land and work. But I talk to people all the time, and when managers come into our offices and they're like, hey, hi, good morning, how are you? Like, how was your weekend? The whole time in our heads as directs, we're thinking to ourselves, all right, what do they want? And when are they going to go away? And we're just sitting there hanging like, surely they're here for a purpose, right? Like, surely this is about something. And we're having the conversation. We're chatting, but also at the same time, we're like, okay, there's surely a purpose to this, right? That means not relationship. That means role power. And we want more relationship, more back and forth, where our directs or the folks
Can you define role power real quick?
Oh, yes, of course I can. Role power is a type of power or influence, I want to say, within organizations that is set up due to structure. If you are somebody's manager, you have role power over them. That is, we oftentimes say, you, as their manager, control their addiction to food, clothing, and shelter. If there is a performance appraisal or a bonus, you are the person responsible for it. And people will do things you tell them to do because they have to. It's their job. Now, they won't like to. They won't do their best, but they'll do them because they have to. And you said so. Relationship power is different. They'll do it because they want to. And they have your back because you have their back. That's a really different kind of managerial structure.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about this idea of building relationships and how important it is to have some sort of consistent way to do that across the organization that you sort of follow with everyone, independent of whether or not they are a people person or not, or whether or not they prefer to be left alone or not. And, it sounds like you're sort of hinting at this one-on-one concept, which, Manager Tools does a great job of teaching. And again, speaking from personal experience, I think this is one of the most helpful and most effective things that someone can implement if they are interested in having some sort of management structure. Even in a relatively flat organization, just having a consistent opportunity to communicate and talk and build relationships in a way that, might seem overly structured at first, but, in reality, avoid some of the negative politicalness that we were talking about previously. Do you mind giving a breakdown of some one-on-one recommendations for people if they're kind of like, okay, this is resonating with me and I'd like to start moving in this direction?
Absolutely. I think the most important things about one-on-ones are that they happen pretty frequently. Like I'm thinking like once a week, worst case scenario, once every couple of weeks. We found that when it gets beyond that to like the once every 3 weeks, once a month area, it feels more like a miniature performance evaluation than an actual relationship building meeting, right? Also important in terms of one-on-ones that we let the direct or the staff member go first to share what they want to share, what's important to them. Again, managers tend to take things over and we want to talk about work. But sometimes our directs want to share things with us, like about what they did on the weekend or what their hobbies are and things that we ought to listen to that they don't have much of an opportunity to talk about. That and things like not taking too long. One-on-ones don't have to be an hour-long process every week, like 20, 30 minutes. Just an opportunity to touch base. What's going on? Like, how are you? Where are we? Especially in the ever-changing world which we currently live, so much happens in the span of 1 week. Every week feels like 3 months in time. Having those opportunities to talk about what we're struggling with, because we're all struggling, is super helpful. I think those are just some of the basics. Managers do them with all of their directs, those kinds of things.
Yeah, sure. And I think a lot of folks might have some hesitation of saying, oh yeah, let me put some additional meetings on my calendar. People sort of, globally hate meetings, like another meeting, right? Especially, again, in folks in the fitness industry, that they may have gotten there because they never wanted to go to some stupid meeting and watch someone, ramble through a PowerPoint again. And so they're like, you're telling me to have meetings? Like, absolutely not. I hate this idea and I don't want to do it. What are they missing?
It's the opportunity for touching base. Now, to be clear, I don't recommend your one-on-ones have a formal structured agenda. More of an open dialogue. Like, you chat for the first 10, right? Just like whatever you want to talk about. Then I probably have some things on my list I want to cover off. You're right. We all hate meetings. I want these to be a formal time set aside, but I don't want them to have the perception of a meeting where we have to sit and we have to take notes and we have to share minutes after the fact and there needs to be an agenda. More informal than that. Like informal, I don't know, let's go grab a coffee or let's just walk around the block and talk, right? Because we're sitting down all day and who wants to do that? Things like that. Just an opportunity for us to converse, to build relationships with one another. And you're right, we buck meetings because we're slammed and we're super busy. And I get it. But the meetings you go to now, to be clear, are probably horrible meetings. That's why you don't like them, right? It's different when you have a relationship building meeting, when you're just batting ideas off each other and running through ideas for the future of the company. That's really different. It should be a time specifically set aside to meet, but not a meeting. And that just speaks back to, Todd, our whole conversation about politics. It's really easy to build relationships with people who have tons in common with you. You don't need to have a one-on-one meeting with somebody that you talk to constantly because you have so many things in common and on the weekends you're hanging out. But what happens when you have somebody on your team that you've got nothing in common with? Your ages are so completely different and you don't even know how to relate to that person. Now what? You don't have a relationship with them? That seems like you're missing a really key part of being their manager. You're going to do one-on-ones with just that person because you don't have a great natural relationship with them, but not with the others because you already do? Okay, that's a weird message you've chosen to send to the team, right? It's having that place. And if you and your director are like, yeah, no, I don't think we need it this week. All right, let's cancel it. I'm good. But if you need it, it's there, just in case.
Yeah, love that. So with the idea of having these one-on-ones, something I've noticed as well from implementing structure like that is that even though it may add meetings to your calendar and may look like it's making you more busy, it tends to actually just consolidate a lot of communication as well. Right. So rather than being like, oh, I have another meeting, which, you know, as someone who also identifies as not as much of a people person, right? And like everyone, don't love meetings. But I've certainly seen that by having consistent check-ins with people, that you can sort of push a lot of communication to that specific time frame, rather than having things either snowball to the point that they're a large thing that becomes urgent, or getting a lot of pings from people asking things that are not necessarily urgent and, you know, aren't necessarily important, but are just kind of like, oh, I had this random idea. And if you have a scheduled time, then a lot of that ends up in that time instead.
Absolutely, Todd. That is probably the number one reason we recommend weekly. Because every time your direct wants to send you that random email, you know, the random email that you don't answer because you're like, oh, well, this is unimportant right now. File 13 with that. Every time they Slack you or text you or try and stop you in the hallway or pop by your desk. All those times when right now you're like, I'm sorry, I don't have time. Like, I'm running to another thing, or I'm really trying to focus. Can we just talk later? By having a weekly one-on-one, it allows for directs to, every single time they want to ping you, evaluate the importance of that item against your next one-on-one. If your one-on-one's every week, and it's Tuesday now, you think to yourself, oh my goodness, I gotta stop. I should pop by and ask Todd this. When's my one-on-one though? Oh, it's Thursday? Okay, let's can wait till Thursday. Nothing is that urgent that can't wait till Thursday. It's only Tuesday today. But if that same item came up in respect to a bi-monthly, like a every second week one-on-one, or a monthly, even worse. And I think to myself, oh my goodness, I got to ask Todd this. When is my next one-on-one? Oh, it's not Thursday. It's next Thursday? Oh no, this can't wait. And it still causes a situation where I have to ping you. You're right. Weekly one-on-ones cause a situation where the noise in between dies down because they trust that they'll see you and have that FaceTime with you to get through their list of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So a lot of folks listening to this are potentially involved in coaching as well, right? Either as a client or as a coach. And so, you know, that potentially means, you know, okay, like here's your exercise program, go and do it because you want to look better, feel better, move better. Or in some cases, it's like, okay, you actually want to be really good at a sport and win and beat people. Yeah. So I've seen a lot of parallels as well with the idea of building relationships and having these consistent communication opportunities and using that relationship to be able to offer feedback in a way that is accepted rather than potentially pushed back upon. This may be a little bit outside of, you know, the stuff that you guys usually teach and talk about at Manager Tools, but do you have any thoughts for someone looking to implement some of these principles as a coach rather than as someone managing in an organization?
Yeah, I think as a coach, you already know well the importance of relationship, whether or not you're intentionally aware of it. You know the importance of finding out from your client what they want from the engagement, right? What areas they're trying to work on or where they want to excel, what's more important or less important. So you already know the value of relationship. And the reason people come back to you as their coach is because they like you. You have that. So from a feedback standpoint, I'm going to say it's a heavy leveraging of the two sentences when you engage in these behaviors, and here is the outcome. That is, as managers or coaches or leaders, when giving feedback to individuals, we tend to have naturally what we would call the two tools. One tends to be praise. Oh my goodness, that was so good. Thank you. Wow, great job. And the other being, I want to say a form of punishment. That is, oh, that was not great. No, right? And when those are the only tools at your disposal, you, one, don't give positive feedback as often as you should. If somebody does just something basic and standard, they have really great form. Oh my goodness, that's so good, Todd. Great work. The way you're standing, that's really good. Like, I mean, you can.
I stand very well.
Do you? Yeah, exactly.
Excellent standing technique.
Right? But yeah, exactly. You can do that. But people are like, okay, I'm just like standing here though. Like, this is just my posture. This is just how I stand. Like, I mean, you can give them praise, but it's weird. Instead, saying, hey, when you stand with a little bit of bend in your knee, it's much better for your form, your posture, your hips and your knees are so much more stable with that, right? It's being more mindful of acknowledging things in a more standard and basic way. And when talking to people about negatives, things that aren't going well, as managers, fight your want to have angry face sometimes. Now, I know myself personally, I suffer from RBF. I think probably everyone that listens to this cast knows what RBF means. And I suffer from it greatly, like so much that sometimes people are like, why are you so angry? I'm not angry, people, but if you tell me I look angry again, I'm going to get there real fast. Don't mess with me. I'm that guy. I know, always. But that angry face that I naturally live with leads people to be like, why are you mad? Like, I barely even made a mistake. Having more of a smile, right? Having more of a neutral expression at worst. Hey, when you stand that way, it's not great for your knees. Just like bend them a bit, right? Leveraging when you, and also I want to say, focus on behavior. I think all human beings tend to boil things up to a 10,000 foot level, maybe less so in respect to coaching, but we tend to boil them up to a motivation or an intent, as if we can pretend to interpret why people possibly do what they do, right? Like an example of, oh, well, when you have an attitude like that, every time you say that, they're like, what's wrong with my attitude, lady? My attitude's great. Yeah, because you started commenting on what you thought an individual meant by their behaviors. Focusing on behaviors, things you can see or hear a person do, increases their openness to accepting feedback.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it, is that you're trying to increase the openness of an individual to actually accept feedback. And that a lot of what we were talking about before from a more managerial perspective is about building a relationship, which then facilitates that openness. Yeah. And in coaching, there's a little bit more of an assumption of a certain type of relationship, because someone is going to decide to be coached by someone if they, like them or whatever. But that the way that you actually build the trust to consistently be able to give feedback is partially by giving feedback in a way that builds trust, if that makes sense. It's kind of like recursive, where it's like, okay, cool. If I give you useful feedback and give you wins based upon that, then you are more easily going to trust me in the future, rather than if I give you some like abstract feedback that kind of doesn't make sense about your attitude, which doesn't actually help you change anything, then that doesn't build trust.
Yeah. If what you're saying to me, I can't take and do something with, it's not helpful. I've had people say to me before, just as a presenter, as a public speaker, well, when you move your arms like that, it makes us think you lack confidence. I'm like, okay, thank you. I don't lack confidence. I can move my arms differently. That's helpful. But if you were to just say, she seems to lack confidence, I'm like, okay, well, I don't. So thanks, I guess. That's not helpful, but
yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and that's kind of, it's on you to try to figure out, okay, how can I be more confident? And you just might be, it came down to something weird you were doing with your arms.
With my arms.
And you're like, oh, I guess maybe I need to look more stern in my facial expressions, which you just mentioned you may already look too stern in your facial expressions. And you're like, all right, we're going to get more stern, more confidence.
I know.
More glaring.
It came down to making large gestures. Seemed to emote that I was trying to, draw attention away from my face. But I'm just that guy that knocks their wine glass over at dinner. That's just me. But I can make smaller arm gestures. I can do that. T-Rex arms.
Yeah. So I love this idea of trying to give people something very tangible that gives them a relatively quick win, especially in a relationship that doesn't, like we said before, have lots and lots of trust already built in it. How do you think about, if you are giving feedback to someone in a coaching scenario, in a management scenario, et cetera, how do you think about what is the appropriate thing to give feedback on? Because I imagine a lot of coaches or a lot of managers are like, you're watching someone do a snatch and you're like, that person just did 15 things wrong. A direct turns in some sort of report and you're like, okay, well, there's all these problems with it. Your grammar's all screwed up here, and you didn't even really do what I asked. And a lot of times managers or coaches will just have a laundry list of things that they want someone to fix, but it's probably not helpful to give them 31 action items. So how do you think about selecting what you want to give feedback on?
I think at a high level, in terms of make sure you're giving on the overall more positive than negative. And I want to say choosing your battles wisely. That is, if you've got somebody that's repeatedly struggling in a specific area and they do it correctly one time, give them positive feedback on that one time they did it right. Lots of times I think as coaches, as managers, we make an assumption that they'll know by the way they feel, or they will know that what they're doing is wrong. Surely they'll come to the right answer on their own. But we tend to leave an absence of communication, or the alternative, focusing heavily on the negative. Focus more on the positive. When they're doing something right, give feedback on that, or talk about it, or make mention of it. And it might seem small and trivial. That's okay. People who hear a lot more positive messaging are more willing to accept some of the negative messaging. Again, going back to things like having a neutral facial expression. I know at Manager Tools we say positive or negative feedback, but every piece of data or information you can deliver to a direct is a piece of information to help them be better. We say positive and negative, but that's not what it is. It's information to help them be better, because feedback's all about the future. I don't want you to turn back at something that went wrong and, oh, well, let's dissect that. And why did you do it that way? And let's talk at length about something that went wrong in the past, because it's over. Let's just be clear, that thing that happened, you can do nothing about. It's over. Step number 1 in all the feedback, get over it. Stop having an emotion about it. It's done. How can we take that information and make it better in the future? And managers lose sight of that. We talk to our directs about things that went wrong or went south, or they weren't great. And we talk about them, but with an eye that's on the past. Every time someone you're working with makes a mistake, it is a positive opportunity for you. If they hadn't have made that mistake, you wouldn't have the opportunity to mention why that way is not good and help them be better next time. Stop thinking about behaviors in terms of bad and good. Think of them in terms of, all right, now that you've done that, let me help you understand the value, or whether or not there is any, of doing it like that, right? It's just looking at behaviors in a different way. If they wouldn't have done it that way, you wouldn't be able to talk about it now. Here we are. Let's mention it. And trust. We actually have a podcast. It changed my life, in my personal estimation. Assume positive intent. All of the people 100% of the time are going out and achieving things, trying their best. Getting down on an individual or talking too much about the negative, all it does is makes them feel bad. They didn't mean to. Have you ever got up in the morning and thought to yourself, you know what I want to do this day? Suck it up. I hope I destroy this day. It's going to be terrible. I'm going to ruin everyone's day and make so many mistakes. It's going to be awful, but I'm invested and I'm doing it. You've never done that in your life. No one does that. Says when they wake up in the morning, I'm going to suck this day. It's going to be terrible. No one does that. So stop interpreting that when people do things wrong. They meant their best. They didn't. All right. How can I help you going forward? That's really what it's about.
Yeah, it sounds like you're recommending that you may get more mileage out of focusing in and reinforcing positive actions and positive behaviors than trying to, like I said before, give people a 15-point list of things they did wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all know, like, as managers, as coaches, if you tweak a couple of small things in terms of the negatives, it influences the others. You don't have to mention all 31 things they did wrong. Mention 1 or 2 things that you think will have an influence positively on other things. And sometimes let them naturally get there. Think of all of the opportunities that people are making mistakes that you're not there to see. You don't hear about. Sometimes managers, I find, they're like, oh, every time I see a nail, I have to hit it with this hammer. Really? Think of all the nails that are sitting around and you didn't see them. If you're going to feel bad about the 1 or 2 things you don't comment on, you should stay awake all night worrying about all the things you never saw to begin with. Because
I'm sure some people do.
Yeah, I'm sure some people do. Like, you don't have to talk about every one of those mistakes. Make a couple of small adjustments. And by focusing on the positive, it increases the likelihood that people will come to you and say, oh, can you give me more guidance? Like, okay, I know that didn't go perfect. Tell me why. Like, what should I work on? When they come to you and ask you to critique them more, that's a really good sign.
So we're talking about this idea of focusing in on positive things that people are doing. And a common concept out there is the idea of the shit sandwich, quote unquote, right? Which is sort of like, you give someone a mild compliment, you give them an area that they need to improve upon, and then you end with a compliment again.
Yes.
And this is sort of intended as a way to be able to correct people without making them defensive.
Yes.
Is that a good idea? Should people be doing that?
Well, Todd, we call it the shit sandwich because it tastes like shit. No, we should not be doing that. We often say communication is what the listener does. That is, it's more important what they hear than it is what you actually say. When we compound them, we do positive, negative, positive, it misses the buck in terms of our directs hear the 3 compounded and they think to themselves, well, that positive wasn't that great. Like, those positives were really only there to cushion the blow of the negative. And it also leads directs to feel as though the positives were there for your benefit, right? Lots of times directs report that. They're like, well, the only reason you added those positives there is to make yourself feel better. So I hope you feel better and your level of confidence delivering it is better, because all I even heard was the negative, but I'm glad you felt good. Right? Directs don't hear the importance or impact of the positives. And so many times, in the manager's estimation, the positives were better than the negative. But by pairing them together, all they heard was the negative and completely lost sight of the positive. Right? Sometimes managers do it so often that their directs will even say, when they just get a positive, and that's a really bad sign. If you give your direct just a positive, like, okay, and that's a really bad sign. You give too many sandwiches.
Yeah, and I think that there's an element too of it feels, I mean, like you mentioned, it feels disingenuous, and that can impact the actual understanding of both the positive and the negative aspect of the feedback, right? That, I mean, like I said before, I'm not necessarily a people person, and I don't mind people being kind of blunt with me. And so when it seems like someone is dancing around an issue, kind of like, just tell me what you want, and I'll do it. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, like, we're all trying our hardest and our best. Just be honest with me. You're right. It feels like we're dancing around. And I know that managers are doing things like the sandwich out of the goodness of their hearts. We're doing it because we care and we're kind, and we don't want you to feel like we're just giving you this negative because you do so much good. That's just a drop in the bucket compared to all the good things you do. But that's not how they hear it. As much as we want them to take it positively, they don't. So don't use it. It doesn't add value.
Yeah. And like you said before, I think a lot of it comes down to that manager's own or coach's own comfort in sort of delivering something in like a relatively blunt, neutral tone, potentially because they haven't actually built a relationship with that person. So they don't feel like they have the rapport to be able to say what they actually think. So they kind of have to do this weird dance. to sneak it in there.
Right? I know. Yeah, no, I totally agree. You're right. Everything comes back to relationship. At the end of the day, it comes back to trust and relationship. And coaches, managers, we feel better delivering those negative messages, I'm going to call them, if we have heightened degree of trust and we know that our directs are open to, or we know the individuals we're working with are open to it. The only way to get there is to show them first that we trust them and show them they can trust us. Then they'll be open without the need to defend themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched on this idea of really building relationships. We've touched on this idea of actually delivering actionable feedback, sort of focusing on the positive. We've given some practical recommendations for people to actually dive into doing this stuff. If they were to kind of start with one specific thing, whether that's with people who they work with, people who they coach, what do you think is the easiest starting point for someone to start working on this?
Putting in place weekly one-on-ones. That is having a weekly opportunity for both parties to meet and converse about what is most important to them. Allowing that individual to share with us what's important to them, what's going on in their lives, what they're struggling with, what they're excelling at, and then doing the same ourselves. One-on-ones we talk about many concepts at Manager Tools, but of the 4 behaviors we talk about predominantly, one-on-ones on a weekly basis was found to increase a manager and their influence over results and retention with their direct team members by 8% in total. And that's one-on-ones alone. One-on-ones is the best way for us to increase and build trust, because in the absence of a weekly opportunity for us to have a touch point, relationships, suffer. We don't talk to each other enough. And so many times I hear individuals share with me that, I've got this friend, my friend, Jill. We have been friends since high school, like since elementary school, frankly. We've been friends. Now we talk to each other once every few months, and it's like we never left each other's side. And the reason that you have those relationships, and we all do, we have that person we never see, but it's like magic when we're together. Don't think about the relationship you have today. Think about the relationship at the beginning. Remember at the beginning? How you guys were inseparable and you were finishing each other's sentences and you were constantly together and you never left one another's side. Remember that? The beginning of the relationship is how you got to where you are today. You can't expect to come into a relationship not knowing somebody and 100% cold and building a relationship like that, starting at only talking with them or touching base on how they feel once a month. Really? You're never going to get there. You have to start at the beginning of the relationship. Talking more often, communicating more often than you think you need to, because that's how relationships are built. By constantly communicating with each other.
Yeah, and sort of like you said before, the relationship is the basis upon which everything else is built. So if there is an easy way to sort of force a relationship to be built, sounds like that might be the starting point.
Yes, weekly one-on-ones. Force that relationship. Yes, because all of us have more in common than we know we do. We're all humans. We all have the same kinds of struggles. We all are living in this world together and knowing all of the competing objectives and difficulty that comes with it. Don't think to yourself ever, I have nothing in common with these people. Because if you think it, you're wrong. I promise you. We all have tons in common. What's missing is the knowledge of what those things are. Creating an opportunity to find where our connections are increases the relationship.
Love it. So Manager Tools has a lot of stuff going on. There's a bunch of podcasts, there's some emails that go out, there's conferences that people can go to. They can go virtually now in the times of COVID. What should people do if they're interested in potentially entering this ecosystem and receiving actionable guidance on some of the stuff that we talked about today?
I'm going to say the first thing is go to our website, manager-tools.com. And there's a search bar at the top of the page. Type in it one-on-one. That is the most immediately important and impactful podcast you can listen to. It's free. All of our podcasts are free to listen to on our website. It'll give you the basis for why and what we recommend in terms of one-on-ones. We also have a newsletter. If you set up an account on our website and become part of our newsletter audience, you can do that. You can email us. Our email address is customerservice@manager-tools.com. And one of us will get back to you. Probably me, in all honesty, as one of the content deliverers. I'll get back. If you're struggling, where do I even start, Sarah? Send an email. Start it with my name. I will be happy to respond and let you know where to start and send you down a path. As managers, we often go through life, go through our careers struggling. And you forget, though, that none of the managers, when they were growing up, when they were kids, no one's mother said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And they're like, "Ooh, middle-level manager. That's what I want to do, Mom." No one ever said that, yo. We all became managers out of a place where, whether or not we thought we wanted it, we were kind of forced into it. So we're in this together. If you're struggling, let me know. Email me. Go to our website. We have at this point, over 1,000 free podcasts. There are podcasts for almost everything you'll struggle with. If you go to that search bar on our website and type body odor, you'll find a podcast on how to have a conversation with your direct about body odor issues. Everything. There's a podcast for everything. Don't struggle in this as if you're alone. If you have a problem, thousands of other people have had it before you.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all of the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E. Or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.